You are listening to PR Radio Station of America.
The story begins with a breaking news alert. Viewers learn that Pennsylvania authorities have uncovered a shocking case of human trafficking involving two immigrant teenage girls. The man at the center of the case is identified as Ramiro Caal Jolomna, now facing serious charges after allegedly forcing minors to work on a Chester County mushroom farm. News crews describe flashing police lights, courthouse steps crowded with reporters, and the stunned reaction of residents as the allegations emerge. The Attorney General quickly characterizes the case as disturbing and heartbreaking, setting the tone for what many are calling a wake-up call about hidden exploitation. The details about the victims make the case even more troubling. Authorities reveal the girls are just 14 and 17 years old, barely old enough to be in high school. Their youth and vulnerability strike a chord with the public. The Attorney General explains that these girls were brought into Pennsylvania under the promise of opportunity, but instead they were trapped in an environment of fear. At their age, most teens are focused on school, friends, and their future, but these two were being coerced into long hours of labor with almost no freedom. Word spreads quickly across Chester County. Local residents express disbelief that such exploitation could happen so close to home. Farmers, shop owners, and parents voice outrage, saying the case tarnishes their community's reputation for honest agricultural work. Some say they suspected something was wrong when they saw unusually young workers on local farms, but never imagined the scope of the abuse. The mushroom industry, a major employer in the region, now faces scrutiny, with critics demanding to know how such abuse could go undetected. Authorities describe how Jolomna was taken into custody. He appeared calm but defiant as he was led into court for arraignment. Prosecutors laid out the charges: trafficking in individuals, involuntary servitude, and other serious offenses. Bail was set at $1 million, reflecting the severity of the allegations. In the courtroom, advocates for immigrant rights sat alongside local families, watching closely. Jolomna's arrest was not just about one man. It raised questions about how many others could be hiding similar crimes behind farm gates and locked doors. Pennsylvania Attorney General Dave Sunday holds a press conference outside the courthouse. He speaks firmly, warning that this case is not an isolated incident. This is a disturbing set of facts involving a man preying on vulnerable girls who only wanted to help their families, he says. His words echo through local news broadcasts that night, as anchors replay the clip again and again. For viewers across Pennsylvania and beyond, Stage 1 ends with a chilling realization: modern-day slavery can exist in plain sight, even in quiet farming communities. Authorities begin piecing together how the girls were brought into Pennsylvania. The 17-year-old from Guatemala had one goal: to support her sick father and family back home. She was told she could work in America, earn wages, and send money back. The 14-year-old's path was less clear, but authorities say she was brought from Mexico under vague promises of work and a better future. Both girls likely imagined opportunity and education, but what awaited them was a life of fear and manipulation. Investigators revealed Jolomna's method of control: debt bondage. The girls were told they owed him money for arranging their passage and housing. Every day of labor was not freedom, but a repayment toward a debt that never seemed to shrink. Authorities describe how Jolomna used the constant threat of deportation as leverage, warning the girls that if they disobeyed, he would call immigration authorities to send them back. For teenagers already in a foreign land, those threats were terrifying enough to keep them silent. The reality of their lives is laid bare. 7 days a week, dawn until dusk, the girls worked in the damp, dark environment of a mushroom farm. There were no weekends, no school, no normal teenage life. Mushrooms require constant tending, temperature, moisture, and harvesting cycles that demand endless labor. The girls were pushed into this relentless routine while their peers elsewhere were in classrooms or enjoying free time. Authorities say the exploitation was both physical and psychological, stripping them of childhood and independence. The Attorney General explains how money was withheld. The 14-year-old's paychecks were allegedly signed over directly to Jolomna, leaving her with nothing. The 17-year-old was allowed to keep only a fraction of her wages, with Jolomna pocketing the rest. Advocates describe this as a classic trafficking tactic, giving just enough to survive, but never enough to build freedom. Local officials stress that the pattern fits larger human trafficking schemes seen across the agricultural industry. While the girls toiled in secrecy, their families back home had little idea of the nightmare unfolding. The Guatemalan girl's father, sick and in need of medical care, believed his daughter was sending money to help. The Mexican girl's family may have thought she was getting an education or safe employment. Instead, both were trapped. This revelation horrified not only their relatives, but also immigrant communities across Pennsylvania, who recognized in these girls' stories the same fears they carried for their own loved ones. Local advocates and school officials began noticing something was wrong. The girls were absent from school, rarely seen outside the farm, and appeared isolated from the community. Neighbors whispered about unusual conditions on the property, including young workers who never seemed to leave the fields. Tips eventually reached state authorities, who flagged the situation as potentially tied to human trafficking. Attorney General Dave Sunday and the Pennsylvania State Police launched a formal inquiry. They cross-referenced employment records, interviewed local residents, and traced sponsorship paperwork from migrant workers. Red flags appeared immediately. The paperwork for the 17-year-old was incomplete and misleading, and the 14-year-old seemed to have no legitimate employment documents at all. These discrepancies confirmed suspicions of illegal labor practices. As investigators dug deeper, they found evidence of coercion. Witnesses reported that the girls appeared fearful and withdrawn, and one neighbor described overhearing threats of deportation. Financial records showed missing wages, signed paychecks, and unexplained transfers tied back to Jolomna. Authorities began building a case of trafficking in individuals and involuntary servitude, crimes carrying heavy penalties under state and federal law. Authorities coordinated a raid with local law enforcement, carefully planning to extract the girls safely. At dawn, officers arrived at the farm, moving quickly to secure the property. The girls were removed from the fields and brought into protective custody. Reports state they were visibly shaken, exhausted, and reluctant to speak at first. Advocates were brought in immediately to provide care, translation, and reassurance that they were no longer under Jolomna's control. Following the rescue, Jolomna was taken into custody. The girls were placed into protective housing where they could begin recovery. Authorities announced charges that included trafficking in individuals, involuntary servitude, and multiple labor violations. Bail was set at $1 million. Officials highlighted the operation as a stark reminder of how vulnerable young immigrants can be exploited under the guise of opportunity. The case drew national attention as an example of human trafficking hidden in plain sight within the agricultural industry. Once in custody, Ramiro Caal Jolomna faced a long list of charges: trafficking in individuals, involuntary servitude, labor exploitation, and child endangerment. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office emphasized that this was not a case of a bad employer, but a criminal act of coercion and control. Prosecutors argued that the 14-year-old had effectively been enslaved, working without legal papers or pay, while the 17-year-old's wages were siphoned off to cover fictitious debts. At the arraignment, the courtroom was packed with reporters, advocates, and concerned community members. The sight of two teenage girls forced into such conditions shocked even seasoned legal professionals. Jolomna appeared calm and unemotional, denying the allegations through his attorney. His defense claimed the girls had agreed to work to support their families and that any money withheld was for room and board. Prosecutors countered with evidence of threats and falsified records. News of the case spread quickly across Pennsylvania and beyond. Advocacy groups rallied outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Children are not slaves," and "Protect the vulnerable." Social media lit up with outrage, with many demanding stricter enforcement against human trafficking in agriculture. Some called it a hidden epidemic, noting that farms, factories, and domestic work are often blind spots where abuse goes unnoticed. Lawmakers weighed in, with some pushing for stronger labor protections for migrant workers and harsher penalties for traffickers. Critics of the current system argued that lax oversight and loopholes in sponsorship programs allow exploitation to thrive. Others pointed out that this case demonstrated how vulnerable undocumented and newly arrived migrants are to coercion when they lack legal protections or fear deportation. As the case moved forward, the girls began to work with advocates and attorneys, providing testimony that painted a grim picture of their daily lives. They described working 7 days a week in grueling conditions, being isolated from peers, and living in constant fear of being deported. Their voices became central to the prosecution's case. For many watching, their courage in testifying symbolized the broader fight against trafficking and exploitation hidden in rural corners of America. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated and returned with a decisive verdict: guilty on all major counts, including trafficking in individuals and involuntary servitude. The courtroom fell silent as the judge handed down a harsh sentence. Jolomna was ordered to serve decades in prison, with no chance of parole for the most serious charges. The judge emphasized that the exploitation of children was an unforgivable act that struck at the core of human dignity. The two teenage girls, flanked by advocates and family members, shed tears of relief. For the first time in years, they felt they had a chance at a normal life. The 14-year-old spoke quietly to reporters, saying she hoped her story would help other girls who are trapped like I was. The older teen expressed a desire to finish her education and eventually pursue a career in social work to support other victims of trafficking. The case sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania and across the nation. Advocacy groups used it as a rallying point to demand stronger laws, more farm inspections, and increased protections for migrant children. News outlets ran investigative pieces on labor trafficking in the agricultural sector, uncovering additional cases where undocumented minors were exploited in farms, factories, and even restaurants. Lawmakers in Pennsylvania introduced new legislation aimed at cracking down on labor trafficking. Proposals included harsher penalties for employers who exploit minors, increased funding for victim support programs, and stricter oversight of sponsorship systems that had been abused in this case. Some politicians argued for a national registry to track human trafficking cases and ensure accountability across state lines. As the dust settled, Jolomna's case became a symbol of both the dangers faced by vulnerable migrant children and the importance of vigilance in protecting them. For the two girls, the journey toward healing was only beginning, but their courage in speaking out had already sparked meaningful change. In classrooms, churches, and communities, their story was retold as a reminder of what happens when power is abused and when children are treated as commodities instead of human beings. The case ended with a sense of justice served, but also a sobering realization. Trafficking and exploitation are hidden in plain sight, and only through awareness, action, and accountability can such tragedies be prevented in the future. This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what's your story? I'll read out the most interesting ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you.